The report I filed said that all 10 of them signed out at the trailhead register on the fourth morning and drove south in 2 vehicles, and I wrote the license plates from memory, and I wrote the weather, clear and cold with the wind out of the west, and I wrote that the heritage survey had finished without incident, and that the group thanked the station for its cooperation. Every word of it was a lie. I have carried that lie for 11 years, badge on my chest, the same boots on the same ridges, smiling at families who stop me on the switchbacks to ask whether the trails are safe, and I tell them yes, and I tell them to stay on the marked path and to come down before the light goes. And what I do not tell them is what walked the ridgeline above us that autumn, or how it learned our names, or how the mountain kept the count when I could not. They came in the last week of October, a party of 10 from a Cheyenne Cultural Foundation out west, here to walk the old stone country of Virginia and to record the stories that still clung to it. And I was the one the station sent to keep them safe. The elder among them was Black Kettle, 61, a slow and careful man with hands like folded leather and a way of listening that made you feel weighed and measured before you had even finished your sentence. Beside him moved Roman Nose, 44, broad through the shoulders, a man who had guided parties in rougher country than this, and who carried the maps rolled in a leather tube across his back. Morning Star was 31, sharp-eyed and unsmiling at her work, the one who ran the recorders and filled the notebooks in a small exact hand. Little Wolf, 38, kept the schedule and the food and the tempers. Two Moons, 52, had grown up on accounts of tall, upright things in high and lonely places, and he did not laugh at those accounts the way the young ones laughed, and the young ones laughed easily in those first hours. There was White Antelope, 26, quick to grin and quicker to volunteer, and War Bonnet, 34, who never set down his camera and who framed every ridge as if the land owed him a photograph, and Whirlwind, 23, all restless motion, unable to stand in one place for the length of a held breath, and Porcupine, the youngest at 19, who had come mostly to be near his grandfather, Black Kettle, and who watched the tree line the way some boys watch the sea, half in love and half afraid. Dull Knife, 47, quiet and precise, rounded out the 10, and when I shook each of their hands at the base of Old Rag Mountain, with the coffee going cold in a paper cup, I had no notion that I was greeting people I would spend the rest of my working life failing to explain. Old Rag is the kind of climb that humbles the confident. The trail begins gentle through hardwood and laurel, then it steepens, then it turns to a scramble across a jumble of granite the size of houses, boulders stacked by nothing human, cracks you must wedge your body into and haul yourself up out of. And by the time you reach the open shoulders of stone near the top, you have earned the whole valley spread out beneath you. We started up in good spirits. War Bonnet fell behind to photograph a stand of hemlock, and Whirlwind ranged ahead and doubled back 3 times, and Porcupine stayed close to the old man, and Black Kettle set the pace, slow and even, pausing now and then to lay a hand flat against a trunk or a face of rock as if he were greeting something. It was at one of those pauses, maybe 2 hours up, that we heard the first knock. It came from somewhere on the slope above us, a single hollow sound, wood struck against wood, deliberate and loud, the way a person might strike a fence post with a length of branch to test it. We all stopped. I told them it was likely a hunter working the ridge, or a limb cracking in the wind, though there was no wind to speak of, and the season was closed. And then, from farther along the slope, a second knock answered the first. 2 Moons went very still. He did not say anything. He only looked at Black Kettle, and Black Kettle looked up the mountain with those weighing eyes. And after a moment the old man said, quietly, so that only those nearest could hear, that the people from the long ago time used to say that the mountains do not take from you. He said the mountains only keep what forgets to leave. Then he began to climb again, and we followed, and I told myself the knocking was nothing, and for a while the mountain let me believe it. We climbed another hour. The smell reached us as we came into the boulder field below the summit. It arrived all at once on a shift of the air, a thick and greasy stench, wet fur and standing water, and something underneath it that was frankly the smell of meat gone wrong, and it was so strong that White Antelope gagged and covered his mouth, and Morning Star stopped her recorder without being told. It hung over us for perhaps 20 seconds, and then the air moved again, and it was gone, entirely, as if a door had opened and shut. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Little Wolf laughed, too quickly, and said something about a dead deer wedged in the rocks, and we all agreed, because agreeing was easier than the alternative, and we pushed on into the maze of granite. That was where we found the first of the structures. In a hollow between three great leaning boulders, out of the wind and out of easy sight, someone had built a thing out of the forest. Saplings as thick as my wrist had been snapped off at the base, not cut, snapped. The pale wood splintered and twisted, and they had been leaned together into a rough standing frame, taller than a man, and other branches had been woven crosswise through them, and the whole thing had a shape to it, a deliberateness, that made the back of my neck go cold. Roman Nose crouched in front of it, and did not touch it. Warbonnet lifted his camera and took 3 photographs, and I remember the small mechanical click of the shutter sounding very loud in that hollow. 2 moons would not come near it at all. He stood back at the edge of the boulders, with his arms folded, and he said, in a flat and careful voice, that his grandmother had described such things to him when he was a boy, and that she had told him, "You do not touch them, and you do not take them apart, because they are not decoration, and they are not children playing. They are a fence. They are the tall one marking where its country begins." If you are watching this, and you have not yet pressed the like or left a single word in the comments, do it now, before you go any deeper into these woods with us, because the ones who came after me deserve to be heard by more than the trees, and your voice on this channel is how their story keeps walking. Nobody in our party had said the word Sasquatch yet. Nobody had said Bigfoot, but standing in that hollow with the snapped saplings leaning over us, and the last of that stench still ghosting at the edge of memory, I think each of us had begun to arrange the same shape in our minds, a shape none of us wanted to finish. We did not linger. We climbed the final stretch to the open summit, and the valley opened beneath us gold and rust with the turning leaves. And for a while the height and the wind and the ordinary business of eating lunch on a rock in the sun pushed the hollow and its fence out of our heads. But I could not stop looking at the boulder field below us, at the black gaps between the stones, and once, only once, while the others were laughing over sandwiches, I saw Porcupine standing apart at the edge of the summit, staring down into those gaps, and I walked over to him and asked what he was looking at, and he did not answer right away. Then he said, so softly that I had to lean in, that something down there had been standing up straight between 2 of the rocks, and that it had been the color of wet bark, and that it had been taller than the rocks on either side of it, and that when he blinked it was gone. I looked where he pointed. I saw stone and shadow, and the black seams between them. I saw nothing that was not the mountain, but the boy was 19 and his face had gone the gray of ash, and I did not tell him he was imagining it, because I did not believe he was. We came down off Old Rag in the failing afternoon, and the knocking followed us. That is the only way I can say it. It did not come closer, and it did not fall behind. It kept our pace on the slope above the trail, one knock and then another answering it, tracking us down the mountain the whole way to the trees. And when we reached the trailhead and the vehicles, the knocking simply stopped, all at once, and the ordinary sounds of the evening woods came back in, and I told the group we would sleep at the campground that night and drive to the caverns in the morning. And I stood by the register a long moment before I signed us in, listening to a silence that felt like being watched by something patient. I did not sleep that first night at the campground. I sat up in the cab of my truck with the window cracked and a rifle across my knees, which was against every regulation I had sworn to uphold, and I listened to the campground settle and go quiet, and twice in the small hours I heard, far off across the sights and up the black slope of the mountain we had come down, a single knock, and each time it was answered from somewhere else on the slope, and each time I told myself it was a falling limb, and each time I knew it was not. Around 3 in the morning, 2 moons came and sat on my tailgate without a word, an older man who could not sleep either, and we sat together in the cold and watched the tree line. And after a long while he told me, in a low, even voice, the way a person tells a thing he has decided you need to carry, that among his people the tall one was never thought of as an animal to be hunted or a monster to be killed. It was thought of as an owner. He said the woods have always had an owner, from before the first people ever walked into them, and that the owner lets you pass and hunt and gather so long as you go gently, and take only what you need, and leave its markers where they stand. and that the trouble only ever comes when a person forgets that he is a guest. I asked him what happens to the ones who forget. He did not answer me. He only looked up the black slope toward where the knocking had come from, and after a while he climbed down and went back to his tent, and I sat alone with the rifle until the sky went gray. The next day we went underground, and I want to tell you that going underground felt like an escape. Luray Caverns is a cathedral beneath the hills, chamber after chamber of stone hung like frozen cloth. Pillars where the ceiling and the floor have grown together across 10,000 years. Pools so still and clear that the reflected stone below looks realer than the stone above. It is cold down there, and quiet. And the quiet is a mineral quiet with no wind in it and no birds. Only the slow, patient drip of water that has been dripping since before there were people to hear it. The group brightened in the caverns. Morning Star ran her recorder, and Black Kettle told a story in the great chamber, and his old voice rolled and folded back on itself in the stone. And for an hour I let myself believe that whatever had marked its fence up on Old Rag was a creature of that mountain and that mountain only, bound to its ridges, and that down here under a different hill we had simply walked out from under its country. Whirlwind did not come into the caverns with us. He said the ceilings pressed on him and made it hard to breathe. And he stayed up top near the mouth of the cave, with a thermos and Warbonnet's spare camera, and none of us thought anything of it, because Whirlwind was always the one who could not be still. When we came up out of the earth 2 hours later into the long gold light of the late afternoon, Whirlwind was sitting on the ground with his back against the retaining wall, and his knees drawn up and his face turned toward the tree line, and he did not look at us when we came out. Morning Star reached him first. She crouched down and said his name, and he flinched as if she had struck him. It took a long time to get it out of him, and when it came in pieces. He said that maybe 40 minutes after we had gone down, the woods across from the cave mouth had gone silent, all the small birds at once, the way they do before a hawk drops. And then, he said, someone had begun calling his name from inside the tree line, not shouting, calling, easily, familiarly, the way you call to someone you know. And the voice, he said, the voice that had been calling him out of the trees to come and see something, to come deeper in, the voice had been Black Kettle's. He had heard the old man's voice, exactly, every rasp and fall of it, calling him by name from the tree line, coaxing him to come in among the trunks, and he had stood up to answer before he remembered that Black Kettle was 200 feet underground beneath solid rock and could not possibly be in those trees. And that, he said, was when he had stopped answering and sat down against the wall and waited for us and refused to look at the trees again, because each time he looked he felt certain that something was looking back and doing an imitation of a man. We were all quiet when he finished. And then Warbonnet, who was not a fanciful person, walked out toward the mouth of the cave to fetch his spare camera from where Whirlwind had left it, and he stopped, and he stood very still, and he called us over without turning around. At the very mouth of the cavern, in the soft red mud where the path met the stone, someone had built another fence. It was smaller than the one on Old Rag, but it was the same. Snapped saplings leaned and woven, unmistakable, and it had not been there when we went down. I would have staked my life on it, and pressed into the mud beside it, deep, was a single track. It was the shape of a foot. It was longer than my boot by half again, and wider than 2 of my hands laid side by side. And the toes had sunk deep at the front where the weight had rolled forward, and there was only the one, as if whatever made it had stepped once out of the trees to leave its mark at the mouth of the place where we had gone to feel safe, and then stepped back. Nobody said the word that night either. But we broke camp in the black of the small hours and drove in silence, and behind us, from somewhere back in the black hills we were leaving, I heard, faintly, a single knock. We should have gone home. I have said that to myself 10,000 times in 11 years, and it changes nothing, because we did not go home, and I was the one wearing the uniform, and if any single person in that group had the authority to load them into their vehicles and turn them west and out of my county, it was me. And I did not do it. I told myself we had 2 sites left on the survey and obligations to the foundation that had paid for the trip. Black Kettle told me, when I raised the idea of leaving in the gray of that next morning, that a story you run away from before its end is a story that will follow you the rest of your life. And he was right, though not in the way either of us meant. So we went on to Natural Bridge. If you have never stood beneath it, I do not know how to make you feel the size of the thing. It is a span of solid stone more than 200 feet high, an arch the land itself carved when the creek that still runs beneath it wore a tunnel through the rock across ages beyond counting. And to stand in the creek bed and look up at that ceiling of stone floating impossibly over your head is to feel very small and very briefly held, like a mouse under a raised hand. We came down the path into the gorge in the middle of the morning, and the light down there was already going to a green gloom, filtered through the leaves above and the massive stone, and the creek ran cold and loud over its bed, and the loudness of the water was the first thing that frightened me, because I understood at once that under the noise of that creek we would not hear anything coming. Morning Star set up to record the way the sound of the water changed under the arch. Warbonnet went ahead along the bank with his camera, and it was Warbonnet who found the tracks. There were many of them this time, not one. A line of them pressed into the wet sand along the edge of the creek where it curved beneath the far side of the arch. The same enormous shape, the same forward roll of the weight, striding upstream and out of sight around the bend, and the stride between them was longer than any stride a person could take at a walk. Roman Nose knelt over them with his jaw set and measured one against his forearm and said nothing, and Two Moons stood back from the water with his arms folded exactly as he had stood back on Old Rag, and Black Kettle looked up at the great arch of stone over us, and then along the creek where the tracks led, and I saw something move through the old man's face that I had not seen before, and it was not fear, or it was not only fear, it was a kind of recognition, and under it, grief. Warbonnet wanted to follow the tracks around the bend. I told him no. And that was when the shape crossed the creek. It came out of the trees on the near bank upstream of us, perhaps 40 yards off, and it stepped down into the water and crossed the creek to the far side, in what could not have been more than 5 strides. And I will tell you exactly what I saw, because I have never told it whole to anyone, and because those people deserve to have someone say it plainly. It walked upright on 2 legs like a man, but it was no man. It stood a head and shoulders taller than the tallest of us, and it was wide in a way that had nothing human in the proportion. The shoulders enormous, the arms long enough that the hands fell near the knees, and it was covered entirely in hair, matted and wet from the crossing, the color of soaked bark, black and brown and streaked with the gray of old wood. It did not lumber. That is the thing I need you to understand. It moved through that fast, cold creek with a terrible ease, sure of every stone under the water, and when it reached the far bank it stopped, and it turned its head, and it looked back at us across the water, and the smell rolled over us on the same instant, that thick, greasy stench of fur and rot, and its eyes in the green gloom caught what little light there was, and threw it back at us, flat and glassy and gold. It looked at us the way you might look at a line of ants that had wandered into your kitchen, without hatred and without fear, with something worse than either, which was a complete and patient indifference to whether we lived. Then it lifted one long arm and it struck a dead limb hanging from a tree beside it. One hollow knock, loud even over the creek, and from the trees all around the gorge, from 3 sides, other knocks answered it. And then it did the thing that broke us. It opened its mouth, and out of it came Morning Star's voice. It called Roman Nose's name in Morning Star's voice, perfectly, every note of it, the exact voice of the woman standing frozen beside me with her recorder still turning in her hands, and Morning Star made a sound I have never forgotten, a small animal sound, and put her hand over her own mouth as if to make sure her voice was still inside her. Then the shape stepped backward into the trees and the green gloom closed over it and it was gone, and we ran. I do not remember all of the running. I remember getting them up the path and out of the gorge, and counting heads in the parking area with my hands shaking so badly I could not hold my pen. And I remember that when I counted I came up 1 short. Whirlwind was gone. He had been behind us on the path. Everyone was sure of it. And then he was not. And when we called his name into the gorge our voices came back off the stone, and nothing else did. We searched the gorge from the arch to the far bend and back again, all of us together because no one would go alone, calling his name until the word stopped sounding like a word at all, and the creek threw our voices back off the stone and swallowed everything else. Roman Nose found a place along the upstream bank where the ferns had been flattened in a wide swath, as if something heavy had lain down there or been dragged. and the crushed ferns led up the slope away from the water and into the timber, and he stood at the bottom of that trampled path with his hands hanging at his sides and looked up it into the trees for a long time. And then he turned and came back to us and said, quietly, that we were not going up there, that going up there was the exact thing it wanted, and no one argued with him. The gloom came down fast in that gorge. We climbed up out of it as the last of the light left the top of the arch. And that was when Little Wolf, who was counting us onto the path the way I should have been, stopped on the flat stone at the head of the trail and would not move. And we came up behind him one at a time and saw what he had found. We found his recorder at the top of the path, where it drops into the gorge, sitting upright on a flat rock, as if it had been set down there with care, and it was still running. And when Morning Star played it back later, in the vehicle, with all of us leaning in and holding our breath, there was the sound of the creek, and there was Whirlwind's own voice, saying he thought he heard someone calling him from up the trail. And then there was a long stretch of only water. And then, very close to the recorder, closer than any of us had been, there was breathing, slow and enormous and wet, and then the recording ended. We never found him. We never found anything of him, and below the flat rock, where his recorder sat, leaned against the trunk of a young tree. Someone had built a small fence of snapped and woven saplings, fresh, the wood still pale and weeping, and I understood then what 2 moons had meant on the first day, that the fences were not decoration, that they marked where its country began, and I understood that we had been walking deeper into that country for 3 days without ever once turning around. Black Kettle did not weep. He sat in the vehicle, with his hands open on his knees, and he looked out at the dark shape of the hills, and after a long while he said that his grandmother had been wrong about one thing. He said the old people always told it that the mountains keep what forgets to leave. But Whirlwind had not forgotten to leave, he said. Whirlwind had wanted to leave more than any of them. Whirlwind had been kept anyway. And that, the old man said, was the part the stories never told you, that the keeping had nothing to do with your forgetting, that it chose, and that remembering to leave saved no one. We had one sight left, and I would have burned my badge before going to it, and I told them so, and it did not matter, because the youngest among us, Porcupine, would not agree to leave the county while there was any chance his people had not truly lost Whirlwind, and Black Kettle would not leave his grandson. And so against every sense I had left, we drove up to Stony Man in the last hour of the light, to make our camp at the overlook and leave from there at dawn, because leaving in the dark on those mountain roads with everyone half out of their minds seemed to me the more certain way to die. Stony Man Lookout sits high on the ridge with the whole valley falling away beneath it to the west, and we reached it as the sun went down red into the far mountains and the gloom came up out of the valley like water filling a bowl. I built a fire. I put my back to the stone of the overlook so that nothing could come at us from behind, and I put the group between me and the fire and the drop. And I sat with my radio in my hand, though I knew there was no one on the other end of it who could help us with this, and we waited for the night to pass. It did not pass quietly. The knocking began not long after full night, from the trees below the overlook, and it was not one knock answered by another anymore. It was many, from all around the base of the lookout, a slow surrounding drumbeat of wood on wood that circled us in the gloom, drawing closer, and then falling back, and then drawing closer. And between the knocks the voices began. They called to us out of the trees in the voices of the ones we had lost. They called in Whirlwind's voice, from 3 directions at once, asking us to come down off the rock, saying he was hurt, saying he was cold, saying he could not find the path. They called in voices I did not know, in a language I took to be Cheyenne, and I saw Black Kettle and 2 Moons go rigid at the sound of it, and I understood that the voices were speaking to them in the tongues of people long dead. Warbonnet had his camera up and was filming the tree line in the firelight, and his hands were steady even as tears ran down his face, and I have often wondered what became of that film. Porcupine sat closest to the edge of the firelight, and I saw him turn his head toward the trees each time the voices called, and I moved to put myself between the boy and the gloom, and I was not fast enough. A voice came out of the trees just below him, low and warm and near, and it was Whirlwind, or it wore Whirlwind, saying the boy's name, saying come here, saying I am right here, and Porcupine stood up. Black Kettle said his grandson's name, once, sharp, the only time I ever heard the old man raise his voice, and the boy did not seem to hear it. He walked to the edge of the firelight with his face turned toward that warm, familiar voice, and he stepped out of the light and into the gloom at the top of the trail. And the old man went after him, up out of his place by the fire and into the black after his grandson without a breath of hesitation. An old man of 61 going straight into the country of that thing for the sake of a boy. And the two of them passed out of the ring of the firelight, and the gloom took them, and I was on my feet with the fire between me and the trail, and I did not follow. I want that written down. I did not follow them. I stood at the fire with the last of that group at my back and the drop behind us, and I let an old man and a boy walk into the dark, because every part of my body had understood, finally and completely, that to walk down that trail was to be kept, and I chose not to be kept. We called their names until our voices gave out. The rest of that night I have tried a great many times to set in order, and I cannot, because it did not happen in an order. It happened all at once and for hours. The knocking circling the base of the lookout, the voices calling us down in the tongues of the living and the dead, the fire burning low, while not one of us would leave the ring of its light to gather more wood. The six of us pressed together with our backs to the stone, and our hands gripping one another by the sleeve, so that no one could be drawn off without the rest of us feeling it go. And once, near the worst of it, something came close behind the fire, close enough that I felt the ground take its weight through the soles of my boots. A slow, deep pressure and then a release. A footfall heavier than any living thing has any right to be, and the smell rolled over us, thick enough to close a throat, and not one of us turned to look at it, because to look was to answer, and we had all learned by then exactly what answering would cost. The knocking stopped near dawn, all at once, the way it had started, and the ordinary birds began, and the gray light came up over the valley and showed us the tree line empty and ordinary and green, and there was no sign that anything had ever been there at all except, at the head of the trail where Porcupine and Black Kettle had gone down, a fence of snapped saplings, taller than the others, and beside it, laid out neat on the flat stone, White Antelope's jacket, folded, though White Antelope had been beside me at the fire all night, or I had believed he was, and when I counted the ones who had lived to see the dawn, White Antelope was not among them either, and to this day I cannot tell you when in that long night he went, or whether the folded jacket meant that the thing had been among us at the fire in the gloom and I had counted a shadow and called it a man. 6 of them came down off Stony Man with me in the morning. Roman Nose, Morning Star, Little Wolf, 2 Moons, Dull Knife, War Bonnet, Whirlwind and Porcupine and Black Kettle and White Antelope did not. And I stood at the trailhead register with my pen in my hand, and the 6 of them waiting gray and silent in the vehicles, and I thought about what I would have to write, and who would come, and the questions there could be no true answers to, and the disbelief, and the searches that would send more people up into that country to be counted, and I thought about the fences marking where its land began, and I did the thing I have never forgiven myself for. I wrote that all 10 of them signed out that morning. I wrote the license plates from memory. I forged the last 4 names into the register in my own hand, Whirlwind and Porcupine and Black Kettle and White Antelope, and I closed the book, and I let them all be lost quietly rather than send others up to be lost loudly. And the 6 who lived scattered west, and I never heard from any of them again, and I have never learned whether they kept the lie or whether the lie simply had nowhere left to go. The old man told me on the first day that the mountains do not take. He told me they only keep what forgets to leave. I know now that he was wrong the first time and right the second, and that both were the same wrongness, because the mountain does not care whether you remember to go. It kept the ones who wanted to stay, and it kept the ones who begged to leave, and it kept a boy who was loved and an old man who loved him, and it let me walk down because I gave it the 4 names and my own silence in trade. And some nights on the far ridges of this park, when the wind falls dead and the birds go quiet all at once, I still hear a single hollow knock come out of the trees, patient, and I do not answer it, and I go on smiling at the families on the switchbacks and telling them the trails are safe, and I keep the count, the true count, the one that is not written in any book, and I wait for the night the mountain decides that 4 names and 11 years of silence were never enough, and it calls me by mine. There is a drawer in the back office of the ranger station below Old Rag Mountain that I have not opened in 3 years. and inside it lies a plaster cast the length of my forearm and half again as wide across the ball of the foot. I poured it myself on a cold morning in the leaf litter under Stony Man Lookout, kneeling in the frost with my hands going numb around the mixing cup. And I have never once shown it to the people I share these trails with now, because the ones who would have understood what it was are gone into the ground, or gone up the mountain, and the ones who remain would only ask me the questions I have spent my whole life learning not to ask. My grandfather was called Black Kettle, and he taught me the rule of the high stones before he taught me my letters, before he taught me to drive the truck along the fire roads, before he taught me any of the ordinary things a man is supposed to pass down to a boy. The rule went like this. You climb to the flat granite above the long drop at Stony Man, and you carry with you one thing that costs you something to give away, a strip of dried meat, a good blade, a coin worn smooth from years in your pocket, and you fit it into the cleft where the rock splits open like a closed hand coming apart. And then you turn, and you walk back down the way you came, and you do not look behind you, not for any sound, not for anything at all, and above all you never climb up there to go looking for the one that the gift is meant for. He said it as plainly as you would tell a small child to keep his fingers off a hot stove. The mountain does not come down the trail after those who leave their offering and keep walking, he told me. It is only the ones who go up looking who are ever found. I was 7 years old the first time he took me up to the stones, and my grandmother came with us, Morning Star, who was old even then and walked leaning on a cane cut from a single length of hickory, and my great-uncle White Antelope, who was the eldest of all of us, and who had made that same climb every autumn since long before the parkway was ever paved. It was White Antelope who had first shown the others the cleft in the rock, though he would never say who had shown it to him, only that the knowing of it ran back further than any name our family still held on to. We went up in the gray hour before true morning, when the whole valley below was drowned under a standing tide of fog, and the only sounds were our own breathing and the small stones turning under our boots. And near the top, where the trees give way to open granite and the wind comes up off the drop carrying a smell of cold stone and running water, I caught another smell laid over the top of that one, a smell I have never been able to forget and have never once come across anywhere else in my life. It was the smell of a wet animal that had been dead a long time and had somehow gone on walking. My great-uncle stopped the moment it reached us, and he laid his flat hand against my chest, and none of them said a single word. Down in the tree line below the granite, something moved that was too tall to be a bear standing on its hind legs, and too silent to be anything a man has a name for, and it did not come toward us, and it did not go away. It only stood among the trunks, where the shadow gathered thickest, and it watched us set the offering into the cleft. I remember that White Antelope did not hurry. He took his time fitting a folded square of red cloth into the split in the stone. And when we turned to go, he took my small hand in his and told me, very quietly, "Do not look, do not look. Walk with me, and do not look." And I did not look, though I wanted to more than I have ever wanted anything before or since. And we walked back down through the fog with that smell thinning behind us, and out in the timber I heard one sound follow us, a single hollow knock of hard wood struck against hard wood, the sound a man makes when he splits a log. Except there was no man up there splitting anything, and nothing answered the knock, and nothing needed to. My grandfather never used the word for it that the visitors use, the word printed across the covers of the paperback books they buy in the gift shop over at the caverns. He had no patience for that word. He said the visitors had made it into something friendly, a shy giant, a big harmless creature keeping politely out of sight, and that this was the most dangerous mistake a living person could make about the thing on the ridge. In our family it carried no name at all, or rather it carried only the shape of a warning, the way you do not speak the name of a sickness out loud inside a house where someone lies ill. What I know of it, I learned from the older ones, in the long evenings when the wind had died down and they let the accounts out a little at a time. And I have spent the years since setting those pieces beside the things I have found for myself in the course of the work, and the picture they make together is nothing like the picture in the paperbacks. Morning Star told me once that our family had never set down a single word of any of it on paper, not ever, that the knowing was handed mouth to mouth and allowed to blur and soften a little with each telling, and that the blurring was not carelessness but mercy, because the thing on the ridge, she said, is drawn toward being known, and the surest way to be left alone by it is to half forget it on purpose. I did not understand what she meant when she said it. I understand it now, and understanding it is the reason my hands will not stay steady tonight. The oldest account I carry is the one they used to tell about Warbonnet, and I never once met the man, because he was lost out of the world long before my father drew his first breath. Warbonnet was a cousin of White Antelope, a big and careful man by every telling, a man who cut timber down along the gorge below Natural Bridge in the years when they were still felling the old growth there, in that stretch of country where they say a young surveyor once carved his own name into the stone beneath the great arch, back when the whole valley was the ragged edge of the map and full of things the survey never recorded. Warbonnet knew the rule the same as everyone in the family knew it, and for most of his life he kept it faithfully. But there came a winter when the cutting had gone poor and the family was hungry, and Warbonnet took it into his head that the offerings we had left up in the high cleft year upon year, the coins and the blades and the good cloth, were only lying up there in the cold doing nobody any good, and that a hungry family had more claim on them than a mountain did. Dull Knife, who was a young man then, and who lived long enough to tell me this himself when he was very old, tried to talk him out of it. Dull Knife was the steady one, the man who never raised his voice and never ran from anything and never once ran toward anything either, and he told Warbonnet that the gifts stopped being gifts the moment you meant to take them back, that a debt is not settled if you reach into the other man's pocket afterward and help yourself to the payment. But Warbonnet went up anyway, in the short gray light of a December afternoon, up the switchbacks toward Stony Man, with an empty grain sack folded under his coat, meaning to clean out the cleft and carry the whole of it home. He did not come back that night. Roman Nose went up after him at first light, and Roman Nose was the one among all of them who was afraid of nothing, and I say that as a plain description and not as any kind of praise, because there is a sort of fearlessness that is really only a failure to understand what you are standing next to. Roman Nose had seen the thing in the trees more than once, and had come away each time convinced it was only an animal. A rare and clever animal, but an animal all the same. And he did not hold with the rule, and he did not leave offerings, and he said so to anyone who would sit still and listen. When Warbonnet did not come home, Roman Nose took his rifle up the mountain in the dawn with Two Moons walking behind him, and Two Moons was the finest tracker any of them ever knew. A man who could read a week-old trail off bare stone, and it was Two Moons who told the rest of what they found up there, because Roman Nose would never speak one word of it again as long as he lived. They found Warbonnet boot tracks going up. They found the grain sack, empty, snagged on a bush 100 feet below the granite. They found the cleft in the rock swept clean, every coin and blade and folded cloth gone out of it. And they found Warbonnet himself, sitting up against the base of the tallest boulder at the very top of the drop, whole and unmarked and stone dead, with his eyes open and his hands folded in his lap, and every offering our family had left in that cleft across 3 generations laid out in a careful row on the ground in front of him, arranged neat as buttons, given back. There was not a single mark on his body. Two Moons said the ground all around him was churned with prints the size of the one I would one day pour into plaster, and that the prints came up to where Warbonnet sat and stopped, and that there was no sign anywhere that he had been carried or dragged, only that he had climbed up there, a strong and living man, and had been made to sit down and give everything back, and had not been permitted to leave. And Two Moons said one more thing that I have carried longer and heavier than all the rest of it, which is that when they came up over the last rise and saw Warbonnet sitting there, the smell was very strong, and the timber below the drop was full of that one hollow knocking, wood on wood, slow and patient, and Roman Nose raised his rifle and fired twice into the trees where the sound was coming from, and the knocking stopped for the length of one held breath, and then it began again, closer, and Roman Nose, who was afraid of nothing, lowered the rifle and did not fire a third time, and the two of them carried Warbonnet down the mountain without a word passing between them, and Roman Nose left an offering at the cleft every autumn for the rest of his natural life. I came into the work the way a man falls into the family trade, without ever quite deciding to, and for the first years I wore the knowledge lightly, the way you do after you have gone away to school and come home again with clean new words for the old things, words like habitat and range and misidentification. I kept the rule because my grandfather had kept it, and because it cost me nothing to leave a coin in a crack in a rock once a year. But I had half persuaded myself it was only a habit, a private way of staying close to the dead. Then the reports began to be my reports. You work these mountains long enough, and you learn that people go missing up here in two different ways. Most of them go missing the ordinary way, the way the paperwork understands: a wrong turn off the saddle trail, a slip on the wet granite of the old rag scramble, a turned ankle, and a cold night, and a bad ending that the search teams can at least locate and carry down and give back to a grieving family. I have brought a good many people down off this mountain, some walking and some not. And those endings are hard, but they are the kind of hard a person can hold in his two hands. And then, once in a great while, there is the other kind. If you have come with me this far, and if you have not yet done the small thing of pressing the like, or leaving a word for me down in the comments, or subscribing to the channel so that the next of these accounts finds its way to you, I would ask you to do it now, right here, while we are still on the gentle grade with the parking lot in sight behind us, because past this point in the telling I lose the ability to pretend, and I would rather you made your small choice while your hands are still steady. The other kind of missing does not leave the trail sign the search teams are trained to read, and I have learned to know it now, the way you come to know a turn in the weather from an old injury before the sky shows anything at all. It arrives with a stretch of woods gone somehow wrong, a silence where there ought to be birdsong, a place on the mountain where the deer will not travel, and the search dogs drop their tails and refuse the line. Little Wolf felt it too. Little Wolf came up through the same family a few years behind me, a second cousin on my mother's side, and he took the ranger work for the same tangled reasons I took it, and he was the only one left on the payroll who had heard the accounts from the old ones the way I had heard them, so he was the only one I could ever speak to plainly. The autumn this began, a young man came up alone to walk the old rag loop on a bright cold Saturday and did not come down. And there was nothing strange in that at first, because it happens, and we ran it as an ordinary search, dogs and volunteers and a spotter plane out of the county field. But on the second morning the dogs took the young man line up past the false summit and into the boulder field, into that maze of granite blocks the size of cabins where the trail stops being a trail and becomes a scramble through cracks and under leaning slabs. And in the very heart of that field the dogs lost the line all at once, the way a candle goes out, and they would not take it up again. And one of the good old hounds, a dog that had worked 100 searches, sat down on the cold rock and shook and could not be moved. Porcupine was handling the dogs that day. He is not family, Porcupine. That is only the name the crew hung on him years ago for the way his hair stood straight up off his head. But he has worked these mountains as long as I have, and he is not a man who frightens easily. And when I climbed up to him in the boulders he did not turn to look at me. He kept staring at the crack between two great leaning slabs where the dog refused to go, and he said, very low, so the volunteers down the slope would not catch it, "There is something down in there, and it is watching us do this." And I went to the crack, and I put my head into the cold air sliding out of it, air that smelled of stone and old still water, and laid faint over the top of all of it, the smell of a wet animal, a long time dead, that has somehow gone on walking. And down in the lightless space under the leaning granite, arranged in a careful row along a flat shelf of stone, right at the edge of where the light gave out, I saw the young man's belongings, his pack, his water bottle, one boot, his phone, set square in the middle of it all, its screen turned up to face the crack of sky, laid out neat as buttons, given back, and from somewhere deeper in the rock, slow and patient and closer than I wanted it to be, came the sound of one piece of hardwood struck against another. I set down nothing true in the report I filed for the young man from the old rag loop. I wrote that the search was suspended after the dogs lost the scent in the boulder field, which was true as far as it went, and I said nothing about the shelf of stone under the leaning slabs, or the pack and the bottle and the single boot and the phone laid out in their neat row with the screen turned up to the sky, because I had gone back before the volunteers reached us, and I had lifted those things out of the crack with my own two hands and carried them down in my own pack, and I let his family bury an empty box, and I have not decided even now whether that was a mercy or a cowardice or only the last thing my grandfather ever taught me without ever saying it out loud, which is that some things are not made any better by being written down. Little Wolf helped me carry the young man gear off the mountain, and neither of us spoke a word the whole way. And at the bottom, at the trailhead, in the ordinary afternoon light with families unloading their coolers from the backs of their cars. Little Wolf finally said the thing we were both turning over, which was that it had never done this before, not in any account we had ever been told, not one time. It had always kept to the high stones, to Stony Man and the Offering Cleft, to its own ground up where the trees begin to thin. It had never before come down into the boulder field of Old Rag where the people are, and taken one of them, and arranged his belongings, and given him back where we would be certain to find them. Something had changed, or something had been changed, and I did not understand what, and I was afraid in a way none of the old accounts had prepared me for, because the old accounts all had rules living inside them, and a thing that keeps to rules can be lived alongside, and a thing that has begun to break its own rules cannot. The one I have put off telling you about is Whirlwind, and I have put it off because he is the part of this that I cannot lay out without the cold coming into my hands, even now, even at this table with the lamp on. Whirlwind was my sister boy, 19 years old that autumn, and he had grown up at the outer edge of the family the way the young ones do now, with the accounts reaching him only in fragments, half heard over the noise of everything else in a young man life, and to him they were not warnings at all. They were an embarrassment, a thing the old people believed the way old people believe in luck and signs and the weather, and he had told me more than once, with the flat certainty that only the young can manage, that there was nothing up on that mountain but rock and rumor. He was not a bad young man. He was only a young man who had never yet been made to sit down in front of something far older than his understanding and hand everything back. And when the young hiker vanished off Old Rag and the story worked its way into the local paper, and then out across the internet, with its talk of dogs refusing the scent and searchers turning back at the boulders, Whirlwind did not feel the thing that I felt. He felt the other thing, the thing that has drawn more curious young men to bad ends than these mountains will ever account for. He felt that here at last was his chance to know for certain, to go up and find the thing that the old fools in his own family had only ever whispered about, and to come back down with the proof of it held in his hand. He found out about the cast. I do not know how. Little Wolf swears to me he never breathed a word of it, and I believe him. But these things travel in a small community, and Whirlwind came to my house one evening in the middle of October, and stood in my kitchen and asked me, half laughing, whether it was true that I had a plaster foot locked away in a drawer down at the station, and I made the worst mistake of my whole life, which was that I did not laugh it off. I did not lie to him. I was tired, and he was family, and some worn-out part of me wanted for once not to be the only one carrying the weight of it. And so I drove him down to the station in the night, and I opened the drawer I have not opened since, and I showed him the cast. I watched his face change. I watched the laughter drain out of it, and I thought, for one foolish moment, that I had frightened him the way the old ones had frightened me on the granite when I was 7 years old, that he would carry the fear home with him and let it teach him something. But that is not what I had done. I had not handed him fear. I had handed him proof, and proof, to a young man like Whirlwind, is not a door that swings shut. It is a door that swings open. Whirlwind went up 11 days later, and I did not know until it was far too late, because he did not tell me. He told the internet. He had found the others out there, the ones who go looking, the message boards and the night hikes and the men with the cameras strapped across their foreheads, and he had fallen in with an idea that had been passing around among them, an idea that the thing did not live up on the open granite at all but underneath it, that these mountains are hollow, shot all through with caves and water-cut passages that no survey has ever fully set on a map, and that the show caverns over at Luray, with their lit walkways and their handrails and their cheerful tour guides, are only the polished front hall of a house that runs black and endless down into the rock beneath the whole length of the valley. Whirlwind became certain that if a person truly wanted to find where the thing denned, the place to look was not up but down, and that somewhere off the marked tour route inside Luray Caverns there was a way through into the wild passages, and that this was where he meant to go. He posted about it. He posted the very night he drove over there, a photograph of the cavern's entrance lit up for the last evening tour, with a few words underneath about how he was going to go and get the proof that his whole family had always been too frightened to go and get for themselves, and by the time Little Wolf saw it and called me it was near to midnight, and Whirlwind had stopped answering his phone. Little Wolf and I drove back over the mountain in the black early hours, with the heater running full, and neither of us able to get warm. Whirlwind car sat in the empty lot at the caverns. parked crooked across two spaces the way the young park when they are in a hurry and believe the rules are meant for other people, and it was unlocked, and his wallet was still lying on the seat, and that frightened me worse than anything, because a young man who leaves his wallet behind is a young man who has stopped thinking about coming back. The caverns were shut and unlit, and we should not have been able to get inside, but the door at the tour entrance stood open, propped with a loose stone, and I have never learned whether Whirlwind propped it there or whether something else did, and I do not care for either answer. Inside, past the place where the walkway lights would have burned, we went down into the earth by the light of our own two lamps, down the long paved path the tours follow, past the great stone columns and the still black pools and the formations that hang like melted candles from a ceiling our lamps could not reach. And it was quiet down in there the way nothing on the surface is ever quiet, a dead flat quiet, with the whole weight of the mountain pressing down on top of it, and our lamps threw two small moving circles onto the wet stone, and everything beyond those two circles was the kind of black that has never in all its existence known a moment of light. We called out for him. Our voices went out into the passages and came back to us wrong, folded and multiplied by the stone, and we followed the tour path all the way to its end, to the place where the handrails stop and a low rope tells the visitors that they have seen everything they are permitted to see, and the rope was down on the ground, and past it the finished path gave way to raw broken stone falling away into a throat in the rock, and up out of that throat, faint and slowly rising, came the smell, the very same smell, wet animal, a long time dead, still walking, and it was climbing up out of the deep places under the mountain into the show cave where it had never been, where it never should have been able to come. And I understood then, standing at that fallen rope with Little Wolf breathing hard at my shoulder, that Whirlwind had been right about the one thing and fatally wrong about the other. He had been right that it went underground. He had been wrong to think that going underground put it any distance away. It had heard him make himself known, out there on the internet for anyone to read, and it had come up to meet him. We went past the rope and down into the throat of the rock, into passages the tours never show and no map I have ever seen will hold, and the ceiling came down to meet us until we were bent double, and then lower still, until we were on our hands and knees in cold running water, with the stone pressing close on every side, and our lamp showing us nothing but the next few feet of wet rock ahead. And I would like to tell you that I was brave for the boy's sake, but I was not. I was more afraid than I have ever been in the whole of my life. And the only thing that kept me crawling forward was the knowing that going back meant turning myself around in that tight, wet blackness, and I could not make my body do it. The knock found us down there. It came through the stone from somewhere ahead of us and below us, one hollow strike and then another, slow and patient and enormous in that closed space, and it did not echo the way our voices had echoed. It seemed to come up out of the rock itself, out of every side at the same moment, as though the mountain had a fist and was knocking with it, and Little Wolf made a sound behind me that I have never heard a grown man make, and that I will not try to put into words. And then the passage opened. It led us out into a chamber whose far side our lamps could not find, a great hollow room in the deep rock with a floor of broken stone and standing water, and on a flat shelf of that stone, right at the trembling edge of our light, laid out in a careful row, were Whirlwind things. His pack, his headlamp, still burning, stood on its end with the beam pointed straight up into the black overhead. His phone, and his grandfather knife, the knife that had belonged to Dull Knife before ever it belonged to him. A knife I had not even known the boy had taken, laid square in the center of everything else, given back. Every last thing he had carried down into the earth, arranged across that stone as neat as buttons, set out and waiting for us to come and find it. And Whirlwind himself was not there. We searched that chamber until our lamps began to yellow and dim and our voices gave out entirely, and there was no sign of him anywhere, no track, no mark, nothing at all. Only his belongings given back and the boy himself kept. And this was the change. This was the thing I had felt at the trailhead and had not been able to put a name to. It had always given them back before. War Bonnet it gave back. All the old accounts end with the person returned, sat down and emptied out and returned, so that the family would have something to bury and a warning to carry forward. But it had stopped giving them back. It was keeping them now. And I have never been able to work out whether that means it has grown hungrier or crueler, or only lonelier down there in the deep of the stone. And I am no longer certain which of those three is the worst thing for a man to lie awake imagining. I went up to the high stones alone in the week after we lost Whirlwind, in the gray before morning, the way White Antelope had carried me up when I was a child, and I do not fully know why I went, whether to offer something, or to beg, or to give myself up to it and have the whole long weight of it over with at last. And I climbed to the flat granite above the drop at Stony Man, with the fog standing in the valley below exactly as it had stood on the first morning of my life that I can truly remember. And I fitted into the cleft in the rock the only thing I had left that cost me anything at all to give, which was the plaster cast, broken now into 3 pieces, that I had carried up out of my drawer and up the mountain in my pack. And I pressed the 3 pieces down into the split in the granite. And then I did not turn, and I did not walk away. I stood there. I broke the rule that I had kept my entire life. I stood at the cleft in the slowly growing light, and I waited, and the smell came. And down in the tree line below the granite, in the very thickest of the standing shadow, it was there. And this time I looked straight at it. I could not tell you what I saw, not because I have forgotten it, but because the shape of it will not hold still in the memory. It slides out from under any words I try to fit around it. Tall past all reason, and as still as the trunks it stood among, and watching me with a patience that was worse than any hunger could ever be. And we stood there together in the gray light, the 2 of us, the last keeper of the accounts and the thing that all the accounts are about. And it did not come for me. It could have. I had broken every rule that was ever meant to keep me safe. I had gone up looking. I had looked, and still it only watched. And after a long while it struck one slow knock against the trunk at its side, wood on wood, patient, and then it was not there any longer, and I was alone on the granite with the fog burning away below me, and I walked back down the mountain a living man, and it was somewhere on the way down that I finally understood. And that understanding is the whole reason I have told you all of this tonight. It did not take me because it does not need to take me. Morning Star told me, all those years ago, that our family never wrote one word of it down, that the knowing was passed mouth to mouth and left to blur and soften on purpose, because the thing on the ridge is drawn toward being known, and the surest protection any of us had was to half forget it. And I have spent the whole of my life doing the exact opposite. I made the cast. I kept the logs. I remembered every account hard and whole and exact, when I was meant to let it soften, and I carried the knowing sharp and bright inside me like a lit lamp held up in the black, and it does not have to take me because I am the one keeping it alive. Whirlwind went up looking, and he was kept. The hiker went up, and he was kept, but I do not have to go up looking anymore. I understood that on the trail down, because I have been looking my whole life long without once rising from my chair, carrying it, tending it, keeping it burning, and now, tonight, telling it to you, every last one of you, clear and whole and exact. I have done the one thing my grandmother swore would draw it. I have made it known again, to more people than our family ever numbered across all its generations put together. And I do not fully know why I have done it, except that a thing this heavy was never meant to be carried by one man alone, and now it is not carried by one man alone. It is yours as well. My grandfather told me that it is only the ones who go up looking who are ever found. He was wrong, or else he was sparing me, because you do not have to go up, you only have to know, and you know now. I have made certain of it. So go and do the small thing I asked you for a while ago, if you have not already. The like, the word down below, the subscribing to the channel, and then, when you close this and the house settles quiet around you, listen, out past the walls, in whatever passes for a tree line where you are, if you should hear it. One hollow knock of wood struck on wood, slow and patient, and far closer than it has any right to be. Do not go to the window. Do not look. I looked, and it let me go because it still has need of me, but it has no need of you at all. It only ever needed you to know, and now you do. The incident report is dated the 11th of October, filed at 3:10 in the morning, and it sits in a drawer at the ranger station at the base of Old Rag Mountain because no one above me has decided what to do with it. I know what is written on those pages because I wrote them, and I wrote them with a hand that would not stop shaking, and I signed my name at the bottom the way any ranger signs a report, and I put the file away because the alternative was to burn it. My rank is not important. The mountain is not important. What matters is that a party of 10 came to me from the west, from a place I had only ever seen on maps, and that only some of them left, and that even those who left did not leave whole. I have worked the trails of the Blue Ridge for 11 seasons. I have carried out the injured on my back. I have found the lost, the drowned, the frozen. I have written many reports. This one is different. This one begins with a phone call in the last week of September, when the maples on Stony Man Lookout were beginning to turn, and a voice on the other end asked for the ranger who knew the old trails, the ones the tourist maps did not mark. I said that was me. The voice said his name was Black Kettle, and that he was calling from Montana, and that he was bringing family to walk the ground his grandfather's grandfather had walked when the Cheyenne still traded east of the Mississippi. I did not know then that the Cheyenne had ever come this far east. I know now. I know because Black Kettle told me things over the following 2 weeks that no textbook I ever read contained, and because he was patient with me the way a man is patient with a child who has been told the wrong story his whole life. He said his people had a name for something that walked in the hollows of these mountains, something older than the settlers, something older than the Powhatan and the Monacan who had lived here before the settlers. He said the name in his language and I could not repeat it, and he laughed at me kindly and said in English it meant the tall one, the one who watches from the standing timber. I said I had heard the local name. He said the local name was a joke a white man made, and the joke had stuck. He said his people did not joke about it. He asked if I would guide his party for 8 days, from Old Rag to Stony Man, down through Natural Bridge, and finally into the mouth of Luray Caverns where his great-grandfather had left something during a journey no one in his family had ever written down. I said yes. I said yes because the fee he offered was fair, and because I was curious, and because it had been a slow season, and because I had never in my life turned down a chance to walk those trails with someone who knew more than I did. That was my first mistake. They arrived on the 9th of October in 2 rented vans. I counted them off the manifest as they came down from the vehicles, and I remember thinking that not one of them looked like the tourists I usually greeted at the trailhead. Black Kettle came first, an old man with a face like weathered oak and hair the color of iron, moving with the slow certainty of someone who has never hurried a day in his life. Behind him came his nephew, whom he introduced as Roman Nose, a man in his 40s with a broad chest and quiet eyes and hands that had done work I could recognize even without asking, the hands of a farrier or a smith. Then came Morningstar, Roman Nose's wife, a woman my own age with a long braid down her back and a leather satchel across her shoulder that I later learned held medicines and small bones and a folded map her grandmother had drawn from memory. Little Wolf was next, a boy of 19 with the restlessness of 19, his eyes moving over the trees the way a young hunter's eyes move. 2 Moons was Black Kettle's daughter, 40 perhaps, a schoolteacher back in Montana, and she stayed close to her father and helped him with the strap of his pack. Dull Knife was Roman Nose's younger brother, a big man who spoke little and smiled less, and I understood within an hour of meeting him that he was there to protect the elders and that he took the responsibility with total seriousness. White Antelope was the oldest after Black Kettle, older even, a woman in her 80s who walked with a carved cane and refused every offer of help I made her. Warbonnet was her son, a heavy-set man of 60 who watched his mother the way Dull Knife watched Black Kettle. Porcupine was a young woman, a granddaughter of White Antelope, who carried a camera and a notebook and was studying at a university in the Midwest. And she said she was here to document what could be documented and to keep what could not be documented in her memory. And last was Whirlwind, a man I could not place in age at all, small and lean, with eyes that were entirely too still, and a way of standing that made me think he had been a soldier once. 10 of them. 10 people from a nation I had read about in one paragraph of one textbook when I was 12, and I was to guide them across 4 locations in 8 days. I remember shaking Black Kettle's hand at the trailhead and feeling that his palm was warm and dry, and that he held my hand a moment longer than the greeting required, and looking into my face as if measuring something. He said, in a voice only I could hear, that we would walk carefully and quietly, and that if anything on the mountain called to me by name I was not to answer. I laughed. I thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. We began the ascent of Old Rag that afternoon under a sky the color of pewter, and the leaves above us were red and gold, and the wind moved through them like a long, slow breath. And for the first 3 hours we walked in silence, and it was the easiest silence I had ever kept with strangers. If you are hearing this and you have not yet pressed the like button beneath the screen, I would ask that you do so now, because the story I am telling took 8 years for me to be willing to tell, and it will take another hour of your evening to hear it through, and the small kindness of your engagement is the only thing that keeps this channel able to bring you what the reports keep hidden. Black Kettle set the pace, and the pace was slower than I would have set on my own, and I quickly understood that he was not slow because he was old, but because he was listening. Every 100 yards or so he would stop and place a palm on the trunk of a tree, and close his eyes for perhaps 10 seconds, and then he would nod, and we would walk on. Roman Nose did the same, though less often. Whirlwind did not touch the trees, but he watched them, and I noticed he never let his back face the same direction of the trail for more than a minute at a time. We reached the first switchback below the granite face of Old Rag at just before 5 in the afternoon, and it was there that White Antelope stopped and said one word in her language, and everyone in the party stopped with her. She was looking at the ground. She was looking at a track. I saw it a moment after she did, and I saw it with the trained eye of a man who has looked at many tracks over many seasons, and I could not name what had left it. It was not a bear. It was not a man. It was longer than the print of a man's boot by half again, and it showed 5 toes, and the arch of the foot was deep and wide, and the earth around the print was pressed down in a ring that suggested a weight I did not want to calculate. I knelt beside it. Porcupine took her camera from her bag and photographed it from every angle. Black Kettle did not look at the print. He looked at the trees on the uphill side of the trail, and he spoke quietly to Roman Nose, and Roman Nose nodded and unslung a small drum from his pack, a hand drum no larger than a dinner plate, and he tapped it 3 times with the flat of his palm, and the sound of it was not loud, but it carried, and something in the trees uphill of us moved, not walked, moved, as if a whole section of the standing timber had shifted its weight by an inch. Little Wolf drew a knife from his belt, a bone-handled thing with a blade the length of my hand, and he held it low against his thigh. Nobody spoke. We stood on that trail for perhaps 3 minutes, and I heard nothing but my own breathing and the distant call of a raven somewhere over the granite. And then Black Kettle turned to me and said that we would make camp lower down, not higher, and that we would build the fire small and keep it burning through the night. We descended 200 vertical feet to a bench of level ground beneath an overhang of granite, and there we made camp, and there we ate a meal of dried meat and cornbread that 2 Moons had baked in her father's kitchen the morning of the flight. And there I began to understand that the 8 days ahead of me were going to be nothing like the 8 days I had planned. Black Kettle sat beside me at the fire, once the others had retired to their tents. He asked me if I had ever heard the sound of laughter in the woods at night when no one was there to laugh. I said I had not. He said I would. He said the tall one had many voices, and one of the voices was the voice of a child crying, and one was the voice of a woman weeping, and one was the voice of a man calling for help, and one was the voice of someone I loved calling my name, and that whichever voice I heard I was not to answer. I asked him if the tall one had ever spoken in his voice to a member of his family. He was quiet for a long time. He said that his brother, whom their grandmother had called Sand Creek because he had been born on the anniversary of the massacre, had walked out of a camp in the Bighorn Mountains 42 years ago in the middle of the night, and that his tracks had led into a stand of pines and had not come out the other side. He said his family had searched for 3 days. He said on the 4th day his mother had heard Sand Creek's voice calling from a ridge above their camp, and she had risen to go to him, and it was Black Kettle who had held her down. He said his mother had never forgiven him for that. He said his mother had died still believing her son was on that ridge, and that Black Kettle had prevented her from reaching him. He said he had learned then that the tall one did not always eat what it took. Sometimes it kept. He did not explain what he meant by kept. I did not ask. I slept badly that night, and when I did sleep, I dreamed of a great weight moving through the trees above our camp. And I woke to find Whirlwind sitting cross-legged at the mouth of my tent, his back to me, watching the tree line. And I understood that no one in that party had slept without a watcher through the night. And I understood that I had been a fool to think this was a trip about history. This was a hunt, or a pilgrimage, or something older than either word. In the morning we broke camp and continued, and by midday we had crested the ridge below the summit of Old Rag, and were moving south along the trail toward Stony Man Lookout. And the weather turned, and a fog rose out of the hollows below us, and by the time we reached the lookout at 3 in the afternoon we could see perhaps 20 feet in any direction. The lookout is a stone platform built on a rock outcrop that on a clear day gives you a view of 40 miles of Shenandoah Valley. On the day we reached it, we could see the platform and we could see each other, and beyond that we could see nothing but a moving gray. It was there that Little Wolf disappeared. He had been at the back of the party and he had stopped to adjust his boot, or so he told Porcupine as he knelt to tie the lace. Porcupine walked ahead perhaps 10 steps to give him privacy, and when she turned around he was not there. The lace was on the ground where he had been kneeling. The boot was there also, only the boot. There were no tracks leading away from the boot, and there were no tracks leading toward it, and there was no sound in the fog, and there was no answer when Roman Nose called his name. We searched for 4 hours. We searched in a spiral outward from the boot, and then in a grid, and then along the trail in both directions. Black Kettle did not join the search. He sat at the lookout with his eyes closed and his hands on his knees and his lips moving silently, and Two Moons sat beside him. Dull Knife led the search, and he led it with the discipline of a man who had done this before, and he was thorough, and it did not matter. At 7:30 in the evening, with the last of the daylight failing and the fog if anything thicker than it had been at midday, we heard Little Wolf's voice. It came from the tree line north of the lookout, from the direction of a slope that fell away into a hollow no trail served. He was calling my name. Not the name I had given him, which was the name on my nameplate. The name my mother had used when I was a child. A name only 3 people alive had ever spoken to me, and none of them were on that mountain. I took 1 step toward the voice, and Black Kettle's hand was on my arm before I took the second. His grip was not gentle. He held me, and he did not look at me, and he said nothing at all, and I stood there frozen while Little Wolf's voice called my mother's name for me, over and over from the fog, and it changed. Slowly. It became my mother's voice calling my name, and then my father's, and then my sister's, who had died when I was 17 and whose voice I had not heard in 26 years. I do not know how long I stood there. I know that at some point I began to weep. I know that Whirlwind moved past me and stood between me and the tree line with his back to the trees and his eyes on my face, and that Morning Star came and took my other arm, and that between them and Black Kettle they walked me back to a hollow in the granite where Warbonnet had already built a small fire, and they sat me down and made me drink a bitter tea Morning Star mixed from something in her satchel, and the voices stopped when the tea reached my stomach. I do not know what was in the tea. I know I stopped hearing them. When I could speak again I asked what had taken Little Wolf. Black Kettle said the Tall One had not taken him. Little Wolf, he said, had walked. I did not understand. He said the Tall One does not take. The Tall One calls. And what walks toward the call is what the Tall One keeps. Little Wolf, he said, had known this. Little Wolf had come on this trip having been warned. Little Wolf had walked anyway. Black Kettle said this without anger and without grief, and I understood that in his understanding of the world, this was not a tragedy but an outcome. An outcome, he said, was the only honest word for what happens when a warned person makes a choice. He said we would sit with the fire until dawn, and in the morning we would continue south to Natural Bridge, and we would not speak Little Wolf's name aloud until we returned to Montana. He said the Tall One still had ears in these woods, and a name spoken was a bridge across which the Tall One could walk. We did as he said. We sat with the fire. Whirlwind did not sleep. Dull Knife did not sleep. I did not sleep. And when at last the sky above the fog began to gray with the approach of dawn, I heard, faint and far away, the sound of a boy laughing. It was Little Wolf's laugh. It was coming from a direction that made no sense, from below the lookout, from a place where no ground existed to stand on. I said nothing. I put my head between my knees. I closed my eyes. And when I opened them again, the fog was lifting, and White Antelope was standing at the edge of the lookout with her cane planted in the stone, and she was speaking to the tree line in a voice I had never heard from her before, and Black Kettle was smiling, and I understood that whatever was coming next was going to be worse than what had already come. We descended out of the Blue Ridge on the morning of the third day, and we made the trailhead by noon, and Roman Nose drove us south in the vans to the visitor center at Natural Bridge, and we walked the trail that leads under the stone arch, and Black Kettle stopped in the middle of the arch and placed both hands on the wall and stood there with his eyes closed for a full 10 minutes. Tourists went past him and photographed the arch, and photographed each other under the arch, and photographed him also, thinking he was part of an exhibit. He did not notice. When he opened his eyes, he turned to me and said his grandfather's grandfather had stood on this exact stone and had left an offering under a specific ledge, and that the ledge was no longer visible because the trail had been paved over it, but that the ledge was still there, 3 feet below the pavement, and that what had been left there was still there also. I asked what had been left. He said a bundle. He said his grandfather's grandfather had been carrying a bundle across the mountains from the Ohio country to the coast on a journey that had been undertaken for reasons no one in his family remembered any longer, and that the bundle had grown too heavy and had been left and had been marked, and that the mark on the ledge above it had been a small pictograph of a walking figure, and that if I looked carefully at the underside of the arch I would see it still. I looked. I did not see it at first. Porcupine handed me her camera, and I zoomed in, and there, 20 feet above the trail on a face of stone the visitor center kept illuminated at night, was a figure I had never noticed in 11 seasons of walking that arch. A stick figure, standing upright, 2 legs and 2 arms, and a round head. And beside it, a smaller mark, like a second smaller figure, curled inward on itself. I asked what the smaller figure was. Black Kettle said it was the mark for something kept. I understood then that the bundle had not held goods. I understood then what had happened to his grandfather's grandfather's traveling companion. I did not ask. He did not offer. We ate lunch at a picnic table near the visitor center, and none of us spoke. And then we drove north again toward Luray, and by 4 in the afternoon we were standing at the tourist entrance to Luray Caverns, and Black Kettle was speaking with the manager, and I heard the manager say that no, they did not permit private groups after hours, and I heard Black Kettle say a name I did not catch, and I saw the manager's expression change, and I saw him hand Black Kettle a ring of keys, and I understood that Black Kettle had connections in this state that I had never suspected. If you are still listening to this account, I will ask you to leave a single word in the comments beneath this video when it ends, any word, so that I know someone heard this all the way through to the finish. Because there are things I need to say aloud, and I need to know they were heard. The caverns closed at 6 that evening. At 6:30 we entered them alone. Black Kettle led. Roman Nose walked beside him. Behind them came 2 moons, then Morning Star, then Dull Knife, then White Antelope, with War Bonnet at her elbow, then Porcupine with her camera, then Whirlwind, and I brought up the rear. 9 of us now, 9 where there had been 10. We descended the main pathway that all the tourists know, past the great columns of Titania's Veil and Saracen's Tent, and then at a place near the pool called Dream Lake. Black Kettle turned off the marked path and walked into a side gallery that had a chain across its mouth and a sign asking guests not to enter. He stepped over the chain, and we followed. The gallery narrowed as we walked, and the ceiling lowered, and after perhaps 100 feet, we came to a place where the natural passage opened into a chamber the tourist tours never visited. It was perhaps 60 feet across and 30 feet high, and its walls were the color of old bone, and at its center was a formation that looked, in the beam of Roman Nose's flashlight, like a chair, a great stone chair, or the fossil of a chair, weathered by the slow drip of water into the shape of a seat and a back and 2 arms. Black Kettle stood before it and did not sit. He spoke to it. He spoke in his own language, and he spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, and none of us moved. When he finished, White Antelope stepped forward with her cane and touched the arm of the chair, and she nodded, and she said one word in English. Empty. Black Kettle turned to me. He said his grandfather's grandfather had left the bundle at Natural Bridge because he had known he could not carry it to its intended destination, which was this chamber. He said the bundle had contained something that his people had kept safe for many generations, something that had come to them from a nation older than theirs, a nation that had lived in these mountains before the Cheyenne had come east and before the Cheyenne had gone west again. He said the bundle had contained a small carved stone, no larger than a man's fist, and that the stone had been made in the shape of a walking figure, and that the walking figure had been the tall one's true name given form. He said his family had been the keepers of that name for 200 years, and that his grandfather's grandfather had been on his way to return the name to this chamber when he had been forced to leave it under the arch, and that no one in his family had ever completed the journey, until now. He reached into his jacket, and he brought out a small object wrapped in leather, and he unwrapped it, and it was a small carved stone in the shape of a walking figure. He had brought the bundle, he had recovered it. He must have gone under the arch at Natural Bridge in the 10 minutes his eyes had been closed, and I had not seen him move. Or someone else had recovered it earlier, perhaps years earlier, and had brought it to him, and he had carried it in his jacket the whole way. I do not know. I only know that he held it now, and that the chamber grew colder, and that Whirlwind at the back of the group turned to face the passage we had come down, and that his hand went to his belt where I now saw for the first time a pistol I had not known he carried. Black Kettle placed the stone on the seat of the chair. He stepped back. He said nothing for a long moment. And then, from the passage behind us, from the direction of the tourist path, from the direction of Dream Lake, we heard footsteps. Slow footsteps, heavy footsteps. Footsteps that did not sound like the footsteps of a man because they did not have the rhythm of a man, and they did not have the length of stride of a man, and the stone under them made a sound I had never heard stone make. Whirlwind fired his pistol once into the passage. The sound of it in that stone chamber was like a bomb, and my ears rang, and I could not hear for perhaps 30 seconds. And when I could hear again, the footsteps had stopped. Not gone. Stopped. Whirlwind said, quietly, that he had not hit anything. He said he had fired past whatever was there because whatever was there could not be killed with a bullet, and he had wanted only to remind it that we were awake. He said in his experience even the tall one respected an armed man who was awake. He said we should leave the chamber now, walking backwards, keeping the chair in our sight, and we should not turn our backs to the passage until we reached the main gallery. We did as he said. It took us 20 minutes to back out of that passage. 20 minutes of walking backwards over uneven stone, watching a chamber grow smaller and smaller behind us, and hearing nothing at all except our own breathing, which was worse than hearing footsteps. When we reached the main gallery, Black Kettle stopped and turned and thanked the caverns aloud in his language, and touched the wall with his palm and then walked out. We followed. We reached the surface at just past midnight. The manager was waiting at the visitor center. He did not ask what had happened. He took the keys from Black Kettle, and he nodded once and he watched us drive away. And I looked back at him through the rear window of the van and I saw that he was crossing himself, and I did not know until that moment that the manager of Luray Caverns was a religious man. The next day, at a motel outside of Front Royal, Porcupine reviewed her photographs. In the images she had taken in the chamber, at the moment Black Kettle placed the stone on the chair, there was a figure standing behind him. It was tall. It was perhaps 8 feet tall. Its face was not visible because its face was not turned toward the camera, but its shoulders were as wide as a doorway, and its hair, or the hair on its body, hung to its wrists. It had not been in the chamber when we were there, or we had not seen it, or it had been there, and only the camera could see it. Porcupine said she wanted to delete the photographs. Black Kettle said no. He said the photographs were now part of the record, and that his family had not made a record for 200 years, and that a record was overdue. She kept the photographs. She has not published them. I do not know if she ever will. We drove back to the airport the following afternoon, and I saw them off at the departure gate, and Black Kettle held my hand again the way he had held it at the trailhead, and he said that Little Wolf's mother would be told her son had walked, and had chosen, and had been kept, and that this was a truthful thing to say, and a merciful thing to say, and both at once. He said the tall one would not call to me again by any voice, because Whirlwind had reminded it. He said I would sleep. I have slept. I have slept for 8 years now. But sometimes, in the last hour before dawn, when the house is quiet and the wind is moving in the trees outside my window, I hear a boy laugh. It is not close. It is not calling me. It is only there, somewhere in the standing timber, in a hollow that no trail serves, in a place beneath the earth where the light has never reached and never will reach. Little Wolf is laughing at something I cannot see, And I lie in my bed and I do not answer, and I do not go to my window, and I wait for the sound to pass. It always passes, and the report is still in the drawer at the ranger station at the base of Old Rag Mountain, and no one above me has decided what to do with it. And I have come to believe, in these last 8 years of waiting, that the answer to the question of what should be done with the report is nothing. Nothing should be done. The report should sit in the drawer, and the drawer should stay closed, and the tall one should sit in the stone chair beneath Luray Caverns, with its name on its lap, and its face turned away from every camera that will ever descend into that chamber. And the walkers should not walk toward the voice, and the elders should keep their names, and the ledges under old paved trails should not be excavated, and the arches should be left standing, and the lookout should be left in fog. That is what I believe. That is what 11 seasons on the Blue Ridge and 1 October with Black Kettle's family taught me. If you are hearing this and you found any part of this account worth the hours of your evening, I would ask you to press the subscribe button at the bottom of the screen, because there are other reports in that drawer, and I have decided, at last, to read them aloud, one at a time, until the drawer is empty. There is a report from Stony Man Lookout, dated the winter of 1983. There is a report from a hollow east of Old Rag with no date on it at all. There is a report written in a hand I do not recognize, on paper older than any paper the ranger station stocks, describing an encounter under the arch at Natural Bridge in a year I will not read aloud until I am ready. There is one more report, sealed in an envelope, that I have not opened. I do not know when I will open it. I do not know if I will open it at all. But when I do, you will hear it here. And Black Kettle, if you are still living, and if by some path this account finds you, I want you to know that I have not spoken his name aloud, not once, not in 8 years. And I understand at last why you asked me not to. The bridge stays down. The tall one stays where you put it. And Little Wolf, wherever he is not called by me. The last radio call came in at 4:14 on a Thursday afternoon, and the voice on the other end sounded like a man trying to speak through wet cloth, offering only 2 words before the line collapsed into a static that has stayed with me every night since. I have worked the Blue Ridge for 11 seasons now, the greater part of them along the ridgelines above Sperryville and Luray. And in that time I have logged more incident reports than I can count, but the folder I keep locked inside the bottom drawer of my station desk is not filed among the others, because what happened between Old Rag Mountain and Stony Man Lookout that autumn does not belong in any archive a supervisor might open by accident. There is a badge number on that folder, and a signature at the bottom, and 10 names from a group that came up the Berry Hollow trailhead on a clear October morning and did not all come back down. I am setting this account down because the anniversary is near, and because I owe the ones who trusted me at least the truth of it, even if the truth is a thing that makes my pen tremble halfway through the writing. They arrived at the ranger station a little after 7, 10 of them in 2 pickup trucks with roof racks and dust still clinging to the wheel wells from a long drive east. Black Kettle stepped out first, an older man with white hair braided down his back, and a face that looked as if the wind had been shaping it for 70 years. He shook my hand in the slow, careful way of a person who has been introduced to strangers all his life, and still gives each one the same weight. Behind him came Roman Nose, tall enough that I had to raise my chin to meet his eyes, with a canvas pack that must have weighed 60 pounds and rested on his shoulders as if it were nothing. Morning Star was next. A young woman in her middle 20s, with a notebook already in her hand and a small recorder clipped to her jacket, and after her came Little Wolf, who had grown up along these mountains, he said, though his grandmother had been born on the western plains. 2 Moons was carrying a camera with a lens as long as my forearm, and he nodded at me without smiling. Dull Knife was older than Black Kettle, if I had to guess, and he moved with the caution of a man who has fallen once and does not intend to fall again. White Antelope stood a little apart from the others, humming something under his breath that I could not quite catch, and when he looked at me his eyes seemed to skip past my face and settle on something behind my shoulder. Warbonnet was a college student, maybe 20 at the outside, with a fresh scrape on his elbow that he told me had come from a rock the day before. Porcupine had the look of a man who had made his mind up about the world long ago and was not likely to change it. And Whirlwind, the youngest, could not have been more than 18, and she carried herself the way a person does when they are trying very hard not to look afraid. They had come, Black Kettle explained, because a story had been carried down in his family for 6 generations. A story of a party of their ancestors who had journeyed east through the mountains in a year when the plains had grown thin, and who had turned back at a place shaped like a broken tooth, and who had spoken afterward of a thing that walked upright and did not belong to any world they knew. Black Kettle had spent the last 12 years piecing the route together from letters, from ledgers in county courthouses, from a map his grandfather had drawn on the back of a feed sack, and the trail his ancestors had walked crossed Old Rag Mountain, continued down through what is now the Luray Caverns, ran along the base of the ridge that holds Natural Bridge, and ended, he believed, at the outcrop we now call Stony Man Lookout. He wanted, he said, to walk that route himself. He wanted to see what his ancestors had seen. He asked if I would guide them, and I told him I would. We started up the Berry Hollow Trail a little after 9, the 10 of them in a loose column behind me, and for the first 2 miles the mountain seemed determined to disprove every worry I had brought with me from the station. The sky was the kind of blue that painters attempt and never quite reach. The air smelled of dry oak leaves and cold water. Whirlwind laughed at something Porcupine muttered under his breath, and even Dull Knife, who had climbed the first switchback with visible effort, was walking easier by the time the trail flattened into the meadow below the rock scramble. Morning Star kept her recorder running and asked me questions I had answered 100 times for other visitors, about the age of the granite, about the black bears that sometimes came through the campsites in September, about whether it was true that a hiker had gone missing on Old Rag in 1959 and never been found. I told her the story I always told, the one about the young man from Charlottesville who had come up alone in a spring storm, and I watched White Antelope out of the corner of my eye as I spoke, because White Antelope had stopped humming and was looking at the ground beside the trail with an expression I could not read. When I asked him what he saw, he said, in a voice that was almost gentle, that the moss had been pressed down by something heavier than a bear, and that whatever had made the depression had done so within the last hour, and that we should keep walking and not look back. Roman Nose looked at him for a long moment, and then adjusted the strap of his pack and said nothing. We reached the base of the rock scramble a little before noon. The scramble is what Old Rag is famous for, a long climb through slabs and crevices and boulder tunnels that turns a hike into something closer to a puzzle, and I stopped there to give the older members of the group a chance to rest before we began. Black Kettle sat on a flat stone and drank water from a metal canteen. Dull Knife lowered himself carefully to the ground beside him. Morning Star sat between them and asked Black Kettle to tell her again about the broken tooth, the place his ancestors had turned back, and Black Kettle closed his eyes and recited what he had memorized as a boy. The broken tooth, he said, was a rock that stood alone on a shelf above the valley, split down the middle by lightning long before any of his people had crossed the river, and the thing that walked upright had been standing beside it when his ancestors first saw it, tall as 2 men on top of each other, with hair the color of wet bark, and eyes that did not shine in the firelight the way an animal's eyes should shine. It had watched them for a long time, Black Kettle said, and it had not moved, and the eldest man in his ancestors' party had told the others to lay down their weapons and to sit and to wait for it to leave, and it had done so, after a while, walking away in a manner that was not quite a walk, and not quite anything else. His ancestors had turned back the next morning. They had not spoken of the thing until they were safely west of the river again, and they had told their children, and their children had told their children, that the thing had watched them all the way down the mountain, though none of them had ever seen it a second time. Morning Star wrote all of this down. 2 Moons took a photograph of Black Kettle sitting on the flat stone. Warbonnet asked whether anyone else had ever seen the thing, and Black Kettle said that he did not know, and that he had never asked. We began the scramble a little after 12:30. It took us almost 2 hours. Roman Nose went first, threading his tall frame through the boulder tunnels with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, and I brought up the rear behind Whirlwind, who moved well but paused at every corner to look back down the trail. Twice I saw her stop and stare at a point somewhere in the trees below the scramble, and twice I asked her what she was watching for, and both times she gave me the same answer, which was that she thought she had seen something move. I told her that black bears sometimes followed groups on this section of trail, curious rather than dangerous, and that the best thing was to make noise and keep moving. She nodded, but she did not look convinced. When we reached the summit, the wind was strong enough to snatch at the loose corners of our jackets, and the view stretched out for 40 miles in every direction, a sea of ridges rolling toward the Shenandoah Valley in the west and toward the Piedmont in the east. Black Kettle stood at the edge of the summit boulder and did not speak for a long time. When he finally turned to me, his eyes were wet, and he said only that his great-grandfather had stood on this same rock, and that he had felt him do so. We ate lunch in the lee of a boulder just below the summit, out of the wind, and it was there that Porcupine noticed the first of the prints. He was not looking for it. He had walked a few yards from the group to relieve himself, and when he came back his face had a stillness to it that made Roman Nose stand up before Porcupine had said a word. Porcupine led us around the boulder and pointed to a strip of soft earth between two shelves of granite. There was a footprint in the earth. It was longer than my hand from wrist to fingertip, wider across the ball than any print I had ever measured, and it had 5 toes, each one splayed and pressed deep, and behind the heel there was a second impression where something had rocked back on its weight. I have seen bear prints. I have seen the prints of hikers who wear those 5-fingered rubber shoes that were popular a few years ago. This was neither. I knelt beside the print and I did not speak. Morningstar crouched next to me and held her recorder over the impression, though there was nothing for it to hear, and Two Moons took photograph after photograph from different angles. Little Wolf said, in a voice that was very quiet, that the print was fresh, that the edges had not yet begun to crumble, and that whatever had made it had been standing here inside the last 20 minutes. Roman Nose looked up at the boulder behind us, at the ledge above it, and at the trees below, and then he looked at me, and he said that we should decide, together, whether to go on. Black Kettle had already made his decision. He said that his ancestors had come this way, and that he would not turn back now, and that if the thing wished to walk beside us for a while, then it could walk. Dull Knife nodded. White Antelope was humming again. We packed up our lunch and we went on. Before I tell you what happened when we reached the descent into the valley, I want to ask you, if you have found yourself leaning toward the screen at any point in the last few minutes, to take 1 second and tap the like button, because the ones who tap it are the reason I keep telling these stories at all. And if you have thoughts about what the group should have done at that print, or about whether Black Kettle made the right call, I would like to hear them in the comments below. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next chapter is where the mountain stopped being a mountain. The descent from Old Rag toward the caverns is a long one. It is not steep in the way the scramble is steep, but it winds through a stretch of forest that even in the middle of the day feels older than the trees themselves, a place where the light comes down in green columns and the air is thick with the smell of leaf mold and standing water. We were about an hour into the descent when White Antelope stopped humming. He stopped so completely, and so suddenly, that Roman Nose reached out and put a hand on his shoulder to see if he was ill. White Antelope did not turn to look at him. He said, softly, that we were being followed. I asked him how he knew. He said that the birds had stopped calling half a mile back, and that he had been waiting to see if they would start again, and that they had not. I listened. The forest was silent. Not the silence of a place at rest, but the silence of a place holding its breath. Roman Nose slid his pack from his shoulders and set it on the ground with a care that suggested he wanted his hands free. Little Wolf did the same. Two Moons raised his camera slowly and began scanning the trees. Morningstar had gone very pale. Warbonnet stepped closer to Whirlwind, and Whirlwind did not seem to notice, because Whirlwind was staring at a point in the trees about 40 yards uphill from where we stood, and her lips had parted, and she was not blinking. I followed her line of sight. At first I saw nothing but the trunks of oaks and the tangle of laurel between them. Then, very slowly, one of the trunks moved. It was not a tree. It had the color of a tree, the color of wet bark just beginning to dry. And it had stood so still against the actual trees that my eyes had refused to sort it out from the background. It was standing on 2 legs. It was tall enough that its head was above the lowest branches of the oak it stood beside, and its shoulders were nearly as wide as the trunk of that oak, and its arms hung to a length that no arms should hang. Its face was in shadow. That much I remember. That much I am willing to write. Whirlwind whispered something in a language I did not know. Black Kettle, behind me, said one word in that same language, and the thing in the trees tilted its head to the side, the way a person tilts a head when they hear a familiar sound from an unexpected direction. It did not move otherwise. It watched us. We watched it. And then, from somewhere farther up the slope, there came a sound that I have spent 4 years trying to describe to myself and have never quite succeeded. It was not a howl. It was not a scream. It was the sound a very large lung would make if it were being emptied slowly through a throat that was not built for human speech but was trying, all the same, to shape a word. The thing in the trees turned its head toward the sound. Then it turned its head back to us. And then, without any warning at all, without a step or a shift of weight that I could see, it was gone. Not moved, not fled. Gone, as if a hand had reached down and lifted it out of the forest. Roman Nose was the first to speak. He said, in a voice I did not recognize, that there were 2 of them. Black Kettle nodded slowly and said that his great-grandfather had never mentioned 2. We stood in the silent forest for a long time. Nobody moved to pick up their pack. Nobody suggested we turn back. I do not know if that was courage or if it was the particular numbness that comes over a person when their mind has been asked to accept more than it is willing to accept. Eventually, because eventually is what happens on a trail, Little Wolf shouldered his pack, and Roman Nose shouldered his, and one by one the rest of us followed. And we went on down the mountain toward the mouth of the caverns, and the birds did not start calling again the whole rest of that afternoon. We made camp that night in a clearing the Park Service maintains for permitted groups, in the last of the daylight, with the mouth of the caverns just visible through a gap in the trees at the far side of the clearing. Dull Knife built the fire. Morning Star sat close to the flames, and wrote in her notebook for a long time without speaking. 2 Moons cleaned the lens of his camera, and checked and rechecked the images on the small screen at the back of it, and after a while he came and sat next to me and showed me the photographs he had taken at the print. In the corner of one of them, at the edge of the frame, there was a shape between 2 trunks that could have been a shadow, or a piece of bark, or a face. I could not tell. I did not want to tell. Warbonnet fell asleep before the fire had burned down. Whirlwind did not sleep at all that night. She sat with her back against a fallen log, and her eyes on the tree line, and every so often she would turn her head very slowly to look at a different section of the trees, as if she were checking a series of doors to make sure they were still closed. I offered to take her watch. She thanked me and said no. Around 3 in the morning, when the fire was low and most of the others were asleep or pretending to be, I heard the sound again. Not near, very far, somewhere up the ridge, at the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. That long, slow emptying of a lung that was trying to shape a word it had no throat for. Black Kettle was awake. He sat up on his bedroll and looked in the direction of the sound, and his face and the coals of the fire looked older than any face I had ever seen. And he said, to no one, that his great-grandfather had heard it too, on this same ridge, and had lived a long life afterward, but had never again slept a whole night through. I did not sleep for the rest of that night either. When the light finally came up gray and thin through the trees, I was already boiling water for coffee, and Whirlwind was where she had been at midnight, still sitting against the log, still watching the trees, and when she looked at me her eyes had a distance in them that I did not like at all. I asked her if she was all right. She said that she had been listening. She said that at some point in the night the sound had come closer, not from the ridge above us but from a place below us, from the direction of the caverns, and that it had circled us twice, and then had gone back down. She said all of this in a voice that was very calm and very quiet, and I did not know what to say to her, so I handed her a cup of coffee, and I did not say anything at all. Luray Caverns opens into the earth through a broad limestone mouth that has been widened over a century of visitors, and the National Park Service maintains a lit path through the main chambers for the daily tours, but our permit allowed us access to a section of the caverns that is not part of any tour and has never been widened or lit. Black Kettle had wanted this section specifically. His grandfather's map showed a route that entered through the main mouth, descended past the great pillars, and turned off at a narrow passage where a stream cuts down into rock too soft to hold a walkway. The park archaeologist had given us permission to enter on the condition that we take nothing and touch nothing. And the archaeologist had also warned me, when we spoke on the phone the week before, that the passage narrows in places to a width of 18 inches, and that anyone with a fear of enclosed spaces should not attempt it. I passed this warning on to the group at breakfast. Nobody dropped out. We entered the caverns a little after 9 in the morning. Roman Nose and Little Wolf carried the headlamps and the spare batteries. Two Moons carried a smaller camera he had brought specifically for the low light. Morning Star had left her notebook at the camp and was carrying only a small waterproof journal and a pencil. Black Kettle led the way in, and I followed just behind him, and behind me came Dull Knife, and behind him the rest in the order they had chosen for themselves. The main chambers of Luray are beautiful in a way that photographs do not quite capture, chambers so tall that the headlamps cannot find the ceiling, columns of dripstone as thick as a man's waist that have been growing for longer than there have been men to see them. Nobody spoke as we walked through. There is a quiet in a cave that is different from any quiet on the surface, a quiet that comes from being under so much rock that the sounds of the world above cannot reach you. It should have been peaceful. It was not. The narrow passage was where the archaeologist had said it would be, a slit in the wall at the far end of the third chamber, marked with a small brass plate the Park Service had left as a warning to unauthorized visitors. Black Kettle stopped in front of it and looked at it for a long time. Then he ducked his head and went through. The passage was every bit as narrow as we had been warned. Roman Nose had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through, and in one place he had to exhale and hold his breath an inch forward before he could continue. Whirlwind, being the smallest of us, moved through it easily, and she did not look afraid of the rock or the tightness, though I could see that her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The passage opened, after perhaps 100 yards, into a chamber that no daylight had ever touched. The sound of dripping water came from somewhere ahead of us. The floor was uneven, wet in places, and the air had a smell to it that I could not place. Sour and mineral and something else underneath, something almost warm. Little Wolf swept his headlamp across the chamber, and the beam caught the far wall, and on the far wall there were markings. They were not modern. They were not the graffiti that sometimes appears in less protected caverns. They were pictographs, made in a red ochre that had faded and been renewed and faded again over what must have been centuries, showing figures standing in a line, and behind the figures, at the top of the wall, a taller figure with arms that hung too long, and above that a spiral, and above the spiral a series of tally marks that I did not try to count. Morning Star drew all of this in her small journal. She did not touch the wall. None of us did. Black Kettle stood in front of the pictographs for a long time. When he finally turned around, his face was calm in a way that I have only ever seen on the face of a man who has just learned that a thing he had hoped was a story was, in fact, not a story at all. He said, quietly, that his great-grandfather had described this wall. He said that his great-grandfather had described the tally marks in particular, and that his great-grandfather had said the marks were the number of times the thing had let the people pass. He said that his great-grandfather had counted them on the visit he had made as a boy, and that they had numbered 47. Little Wolf turned the beam of his headlamp back onto the marks. He counted them aloud. He counted them a second time to be sure. There were 49. Black Kettle nodded slowly. He said that we were the 48th party. He said that he did not know who the 49th had been. I asked him whether he believed the mark was made after a party passed, or after a party did not pass. He did not answer. It was in the chamber past the pictographs, a chamber we had not intended to enter and would not have entered if the floor of the pictograph chamber had not sloped down toward it in a way that funneled us forward without any of us quite deciding to walk, that we lost the first of them. Dull Knife had been at the back of the group. He had been moving slowly because of his age and his knee, and Whirlwind had been walking beside him to steady him. And when we reached the next chamber and turned to make sure everyone had come through, Dull Knife was not there. Whirlwind was standing in the passage, alone, with her head tilted to the side, in a way that reminded me too much of the way the thing in the trees had tilted its head. And when I called her name, she did not answer at first. And when she did, she said, in a voice that was not quite her own, that Dull Knife had turned around. I asked her what she meant. She said that Dull Knife had turned around in the passage, and had walked back the way we had come, and that she had not been able to stop him. Roman Nose went back through the passage at once. He was gone for almost 20 minutes. When he returned, he was breathing hard, and his headlamp was cracked, and there was a scrape along one side of his face that had not been there before. He said that the passage was empty. He said that he had gone all the way back to the pictograph chamber and beyond into the main chambers, and that there was no sign of Dull Knife anywhere. He said that the brass plate at the entrance to the passage had been turned around on its screws, so that the warning faced into the passage instead of out of it. I do not know how to describe what happened to the rest of us in that moment. Black Kettle sat down on the wet floor of the chamber and put his face in his hands. White Antelope began humming again, and the humming was louder now, and the melody had changed into something that sounded like a lament. Morning Star was crying silently. Warbonnet was holding on to Whirlwind's arm, as if he expected her to walk away too, and Whirlwind was staring at the wall of the chamber, at a spot where the ochre pictographs had not reached, and she was saying, over and over, that she could hear him breathing. I asked her who she could hear. She said that she did not know. We left the caverns then. We left them the way you leave a room where a body is lying, in a silence that has weight. And when we came out into the daylight it was already past 2 in the afternoon, and the sun was thin, and there was a cold wind coming down from the ridges. I called the ranger station on my radio and reported Dull Knife missing. I gave his description and his age. I did not describe the pictographs. I did not describe the tally marks. Search parties were dispatched. They searched the caverns for 3 days. They found nothing. Black Kettle asked me, that night at our camp above the caverns, whether I would guide them the rest of the way. I asked him whether he was sure. He said that his ancestors had walked this route to the end, and that the ones who had turned back had regretted it, and that he would not regret it, and that if the mountain wanted more of them, then the mountain would take more of them, but that he would not leave the route unfinished. Nobody argued with him. Nobody left. We were 9 now. We drove south the next morning to Natural Bridge. The bridge itself is a great arch of limestone spanning a creek and a gorge, over 200 feet high and wide enough at the top that Thomas Jefferson once wrote about the sensation of standing beneath it, of being reduced to nothing by the weight of the stone above. We stood beneath it that afternoon in silence. Black Kettle knelt in the water of the creek and washed his hands, and White Antelope stood at the base of one of the bridge's columns and pressed his palm to the stone and closed his eyes and did not open them again for a long time. When he did, he said, in a voice that was heavy with something I could not name, that this was the place where his people had left an offering, on the journey his great-grandfather had described. He said that his people had left the offering because the thing had walked with them beneath the bridge and had not attacked them and had watched them from the far bank while they crossed. He said that the offering had been a strip of red cloth tied to a root that grew out of the base of the column. I looked at the base of the column. There was a root growing out of it. There was no cloth. Whirlwind, without a word, took a red bandana out of her pocket. She tied it to the root. Nobody stopped her. We slept that night in a hotel a few miles from the bridge. 2 rooms, 4 beds each, and we drew straws for who would sleep on the floor. I took the floor of one of the rooms myself because I did not intend to sleep, and I did not. Around midnight, the door to my room opened. I was awake. I saw it open. There was nothing on the other side of it, no shape, no person, just the empty corridor of the hotel. I got up and closed the door and locked it. 10 minutes later it opened again. I closed it again. I did not open it a third time. In the morning, White Antelope was not in the other room. His bed had been made. His pack was still where he had left it. His shoes were placed neatly at the foot of the bed. He was gone. The hotel had cameras on the corridors. The manager showed me the footage that afternoon. The camera showed the corridor outside our rooms. It showed the door to the second room opening at 3:17 in the morning. It showed White Antelope stepping out into the corridor. It showed him walking, in his socks, past the elevators, past the stairwell, past the front desk, and out the front doors of the hotel into the parking lot, and out of the frame of the camera. There was no footage from the parking lot. The camera there had been broken for 3 months. Black Kettle sat in the lobby of the hotel for 2 hours before he could stand up. When he did, he said that we would continue. We were 8. We drove north up the parkway that afternoon, back into the mountains, and by evening we had reached the trailhead for Stony Man Lookout. Stony Man is not a hard climb. The trail is well maintained, and the summit is only a mile and a half from the parking area. The lookout itself is a rocky outcrop that faces west over the Shenandoah Valley, and on a clear evening the view is one of the finest in the park. That evening was clear. The sun was setting behind the distant blue folds of the mountains, and the light was the kind of golden red that photographers travel a long way to see. We reached the lookout 20 minutes before sunset. Black Kettle stood at the edge and looked out. He had brought a small pouch of tobacco with him from the truck, and he opened it, and he sprinkled the tobacco off the edge of the lookout and into the wind, and he said the names of his ancestors aloud, one by one, in the language they had spoken. He said the name of his great-grandfather. He said the name of Dull Knife and of White Antelope, and his voice did not break, though tears ran freely down his face. When he finished, he turned to the rest of us. He said that this was the place. He said that his ancestors had stood on this rock and had looked west toward home and had prayed, and that the thing had stood on the rock behind them, on the higher shelf where the true summit of the Stony Man rises, and had watched and had not touched them. He said that if we were fortunate, the thing would watch and would not touch us either. He asked us to turn, together, and face the higher shelf. We turned. There was nothing there. Just the granite, and the wind, and the last light of the sun catching the leaves of the oaks that grew up along the summit. Nothing. Roman Nose let out a breath that he had been holding for what looked like the whole afternoon. Morning Star laughed a small, surprised laugh. Warbonnet put his hand on Whirlwind's shoulder. Whirlwind did not laugh. Whirlwind was looking at the shelf, and she was not blinking, and I followed her line of sight, and I understood then, as one sometimes understands things all at once, that the reason we could not see it was not that it was not there. It was that we were not looking at the right layer of the world. Something in me, in the middle of my chest, went very still. Black Kettle said, softly, that we should thank it. He said the words in his ancestors' language. He said them again in English. He said, "Thank you for letting us pass." And then, as the last edge of the sun slipped below the ridge, we heard the sound again. Not from the higher shelf, from directly behind us, from the edge of the lookout where Black Kettle had scattered his tobacco, from the empty air that opened out over the 2,000 feet of valley below, the long, slow emptying of a lung that was trying to shape a word. I did not turn. None of us turned. We stood facing the higher shelf, as Black Kettle had asked, and we listened to the sound, and we felt something pass close behind our backs, close enough that I could feel the disturbance of the air on the back of my neck. And then the sound was gone, and the air was still, and Black Kettle whispered that we should go down the trail now, and that we should not look back until we reached the parking area. We went. We did not look back. Porcupine, who had walked at the front of the group all afternoon, was not with us when we reached the parking area. Nobody had seen him leave the lookout. Nobody had heard him go. Whirlwind, who had been walking behind him for the last stretch of trail, said that she had been watching his back the entire way, and that at some point his back had simply stopped being there, and that she had continued walking anyway, because she had understood, somehow, that stopping was not permitted. We were 7. Black Kettle asked me, at the parking area, whether the tally on the wall in the cavern would now read 50. I did not know how to answer him. I still do not. We drove down out of the mountains that night. We stopped at a diner on the way and ate a meal that none of us tasted. We shook hands in the parking lot of the ranger station at 2 in the morning, and Black Kettle held my hand a long time, and he told me that he was grateful. Grateful, that was the word he used. The 7 of them drove west the next day, in the 2 trucks, and I have not seen any of them since. Morning Star sent me a letter 3 months later, thanking me for the guide work, and enclosing a photograph she had drawn from memory of the pictographs on the cavern wall. In her drawing, the tally marks numbered 50. She had not been able to see the 50th mark clearly, she wrote, but she was certain, in a way she could not explain, that it was there. I keep the letter in the folder in the bottom drawer of my station desk. I keep the folder locked. I have not gone back to Old Rag Mountain since. I have not entered the caverns. I have not walked beneath Natural Bridge. I have not climbed Stony Man Lookout. My supervisor has asked me, more than once, whether there is a reason. I have told him that I no longer feel qualified to lead groups on those particular trails. He has not pressed the matter. Sometimes, on the nights when the wind is coming from the west and the moon is low behind the ridge, I sit in the ranger station with the radio turned to the channel we were on that afternoon, and I listen to the static, and I wait to hear the 2 words that came through at 4:14. I have not heard them again. I do not know whether I would answer if I did. And now, if you have listened this far, I would ask you one last thing, which is that if you know someone who walks the Blue Ridge, someone who plans a trip to Old Rag or Luray or Natural Bridge or Stony Man, someone who thinks they might climb up to look out over the valley on a clear October evening, share this story with them and leave a comment below telling me what you would have done if you had been standing on that lookout. And tap the like button one last time before you go, and subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss the next account I set down. Tell them what the thing on the higher shelf does. Tell them what the tally marks mean. And tell them, if they should feel the air move behind their backs at the edge of the lookout, that the one thing they must not do, no matter what they hear, no matter what they feel,